7 decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public.
Portions of the Dead Sea Scrolls are here at DC's Museum of the Bible, removing all obscurity and open for all to see.
For 70 years, the Dead Sea Scrolls held onto a secret nobody thought to look for. The question everyone asked was always the same. What do these texts say? Generation after generation of scholars were certain it was the only question worth asking. Nobody stopped to ask the other one. What are they made of? Then, in a laboratory at Tel Aviv University, a molecular biologist named Oded Richavi pulled ancient genetic material out of dust collected from a single fragment, ran the sequence, and stopped cold. The animal whose hide had become that piece of parchment could not have been alive anywhere near the cave where it was discovered. Not for a season, not for a single day. And that one impossible result was about to unravel everything scholars believed they understood about the most famous manuscripts on Earth. This is a sample from one of the major scrolls. We have 5 of them, remarkably well preserved considering they came from a cave. To understand why that result mattered so much, you have to go back to where this all began, to a hillside above the Dead Sea, and a shepherd who had no idea he was about to change history. A stone thrown into the dark. In 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Eddib tossed a rock into a cave near the shore of the Dead Sea, chasing after a missing goat. He heard something shatter. Curious, he climbed inside and found ancient clay jars sealed for centuries, holding leather scrolls wrapped carefully in linen. He had no way of knowing what he'd stumbled onto. Neither did anyone else. Not yet. He was searching for a lost goat. When he reached the mouth of a cave, he tossed a stone inside just to see if the animal might bolt out. What he'd found would become the single most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century. The oldest biblical manuscripts known to exist, some reaching back more than 2,000 years. Between 1947 and 1956, roughly 25,000 fragments representing close to 1,000 separate manuscripts were pulled from 11 caves near the ruins of Qumran. They contain the earliest known copies of Genesis, Isaiah, and Psalms, alongside sectarian rulebooks, hymns, and visions of apocalypse. Texts spanning from around 250 BCE to 68 CE, the single most volatile stretch in the history of both Judaism and the earliest Christian movement. Sealed away in the dry Judean desert, these scrolls had quietly outlived the Second Temple, outlived Rome, outlived every empire that had risen and crumbled across 2,000 years above them. But when scholars finally opened them, the texts didn't hand over easy answers. They handed over questions that would take 7 decades even to begin answering. Where had they come from? Who had written them? Why were they hidden away in this particular corner of the desert? For most of those 70 years, scholars believed they had it figured out. They were wrong. The theory that held for decades researchers from institutions around the globe pored over every visible detail these fragments offered. Working with nothing but their eyes, their training, and their instincts, they compared handwriting stroke by stroke. They studied the color, texture, and thickness of the parchment, hoping to match pieces back to a single source animal. They cross-referenced language, theology, calendar systems, literary structure, anything that might reveal a hidden pattern. These are the earliest copies of the Bible that exist, older than anything scholars had access to before. The theory that took hold pointed to the Essenes, a Jewish sect described by ancient historians like Josephus and Pliny the Elder as a secluded monastic community in the Judean wilderness devoted to purity, scripture copying, and the coming of divine judgment on a corrupted world. The ruins at Qumran, sitting just beside the caves, looked exactly like the kind of settlement Josephus had described centuries earlier. The pieces seemed to fit together almost too well. The sectarian texts described a self-contained religious community with its own leadership, its own laws, and a solar calendar that broke sharply from the lunar calendar kept by the priests in Jerusalem, a direct theological challenge to the establishment at the temple. The apocalyptic writings burned with hostility toward that temple establishment. The War Scroll, describing a final cosmic showdown between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, read exactly like something a breakaway sect would produce to make sense of its own exile from mainstream Jewish life. The conclusion felt airtight. The Essenes lived at Qumran, copied their scripture there, and when Rome crushed the Jewish revolt in 68 CE, they buried their library in the surrounding caves for safekeeping. For decades, that was the accepted story, taught in seminaries, featured in museum exhibitions, repeated in documentary after documentary. The Dead Sea Scrolls were the Essenes' private collection. Case closed. Nothing left to debate. Stay with this because everything you just heard is about to come apart at the seams. Cracks nobody could close. The Essene theory dominated for 70 years, but underneath its surface, uncomfortable details kept quietly surfacing. Details the tools of the time simply weren't equipped to resolve. The scrolls showed wild, almost almost bewildering textual variation. Different versions of the same biblical books sat side by side. Different scripts, different hands, different levels of skill. Parchment quality ranged from expertly prepared skins to rough, almost amateurish material sitting right beside them in the same cave. When radiocarbon dating was finally applied to a sample of fragments in the early 1990s, some scrolls turned out to predate the Qumran settlement itself. The chronology simply didn't add up the way the theory required, and nobody could explain the deeper puzzle underneath all of it. Why would one isolated, tightly disciplined sect hold on to multiple contradictory versions of its own sacred texts? Why keep two entirely different editions of the Book of Jeremiah, one substantially longer than the other, with whole passages missing and chapters rearranged inside a community supposedly built on rigid religious uniformity? Some scholars floated alternatives at the margins of the field. Maybe Qumran wasn't a monastery at all, a pottery workshop, a winter estate, a military outpost. Maybe the caves functioned as a sacred depository where worn-out texts from many communities were brought to be respectfully retired rather than discarded. These ideas existed, but none carried the hard evidence needed to dethrone a paradigm that had held for generations. Then something arrived from a direction nobody in the field expected. Not an archaeologist, not a theologian, a geneticist over lunch. The lunch that changed everything. In 2012, at a table in Tel Aviv University, molecular biologist Oded Richavi sat down with biblical scholar Noam Mizrahi. The conversation drifted, as conversations between old colleagues often do, toward the Dead Sea Scrolls, toward the maddening difficulty of matching thousands of tiny disconnected fragments, and toward the questions that 70 years of careful scholarship had never managed to close. Mizrahi laid it out plainly. 25,000 fragments, no titles, no page numbers, no reliable way to connect one piece of parchment to another beyond handwriting comparisons and educated guesswork about how old skin looked. Methods that were subjective, imprecise, and capable of being catastrophically wrong without anyone realizing it. Richavi listened carefully. Then he asked one simple question. What are the scrolls actually made of? Parchment, Mizrahi said. Animal skin. Richavi paused for a long moment. Parchment has DNA. That single sentence opened an entirely new field of inquiry that nobody had thought to pursue. Richavi specialized in ancient DNA analysis, a method that had already reshaped the study of human prehistory, tracing migration patterns and population history across tens of thousands of years. In that moment, at that lunch table, he realized nobody had ever pointed that same method at a manuscript, at scripture itself. Turns out this one is cowhide. So we have two fragments that came back as cowhide. Together with Nina Shore, curator of the Dead Sea Scrolls at the Israel Antiquities Authority, Richavi and Mizrahi assembled the small team that would spend the next several years chasing something no one had ever attempted before them. What they found along the way would unsettle even the people who had spent their entire careers protecting these fragile, irreplaceable texts. Reading genetics without a touch. Here was the first obstacle, and it was serious. The Dead Sea Scrolls are sacred to multiple faiths, and by definition entirely irreplaceable. Any method involving cutting, drilling, or removing physical samples was off the table from the start. The scrolls had to stay whole, untouched. So, how do you read the genetic history of something you are absolutely forbidden to touch? The answer had been sitting there the entire time, hiding in plain sight, inside the storage boxes themselves. Decades of careful handling had left behind fine particles of parchment dust, quietly accumulating at the bottom of the containers. That dust held collagen, the structural protein found in animal skin, and locked inside it, preserved across 2,000 years, was ancient genetic material. By gathering dust from blank margins and worn edges, places where no writing had ever existed, the team could collect enough material without ever touching the inked text itself. The evidence had been waiting quietly in that dust the entire time, through every study and every decade of scholarly debate. But turning that dust into usable genetic sequences was brutal work. The very process of making parchment, soaking, scraping, stretching, sizing, drying, damages DNA at a molecular level. The iron-based inks used on many scrolls are chemically corrosive, and after all of that, the scrolls spent 2,000 years in desert caves before being handled by hundreds of researchers over the following 70 years, each one potentially leaving traces of modern contamination. The team worked inside dedicated ancient DNA facilities that resembled clean rooms more than archives. Full protective suits, positive air pressure, ultraviolet sterilization. They built strict authentication protocols to confirm their results were genuinely ancient and not contamination from modern hands, hunting for patterns of molecular decay only accumulate across centuries, running samples through through multiple independent extractions, cross-checking every result between separate laboratories. Took years, hundreds of samples, repeated failure, but eventually they assembled reliable genetic sequences from dozens of fragments. And when Richavi finally studied what those sequences showed him, he reached for his phone. The cow that broke the theory. Most fragments matched expectations without incident. Sheepskin, the standard material used throughout ancient Judea, taken from an animal fully capable of surviving in a harsh desert environment like Qumran, but a handful of fragments came back as something else entirely, something that shouldn't have been possible. Cowhide. Noam Mizrahi stared at that result for a long time. He knew Qumran intimately, the texts, the terrain, the long, difficult history of the site, and he sat with the data in silence before he said anything to anyone. Because cow parchment at Qumran wasn't just an anomaly to be footnoted and set aside. It was physically, geographically impossible. Qumran sits in the Judean desert beside the Dead Sea, one of the harshest, driest environments found anywhere on the planet. Sheep and goats can survive there. They're built for arid land, for minimal water, for tough scrub vegetation that would starve most other livestock. Cattle simply cannot. A single cow needs dozens of gallons of water every day and substantial grazing pasture to survive, let alone thrive. There was no version of a community living at Qumran that could have also raised cattle nearby. Cow parchment simply could not have been produced in that desert, full stop, which meant any scroll written on cowhide had originated somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with real water and real grassland. The theory wasn't slightly off. It was wrong. Wrong in a way that one single cow made completely undeniable. When that result crossed Nina Shore's desk at the Israel Antiquities Authority, she stopped reading and simply sat with it. She had spent her entire career as custodian of these fragments. She knew the dust in those storage boxes better than most people know the rooms of their own homes. She read the finding twice, slowly, to make sure she understood it correctly. She would later say it felt like the room had tilted beneath her, that this wasn't only a challenge to the Essene theory, but to the entire framework scholars had built for understanding what the Dead Sea Scrolls actually were. And the cowhide wasn't scattered randomly across the collection, which would have been strange enough on its own. It clustered around specific texts, specific versions of specific books, which is exactly where the genetics gets stranger still. Fingerprints inside the parchment. Here's what the team could now do that no one before them had ever done. By comparing genetic markers across different parchment samples, they could determine whether separate fragments came from the very same individual animal. Two pieces of parchment from one sheep carry nearly identical mitochondrial DNA. Two pieces from different sheep simply don't. For 70 years, matching fragments had relied entirely on guesswork. Now, for the first time, there was hard genetic evidence, actual fingerprints written into the material itself. Take the Book of Jeremiah as the clearest example. Two dramatically different versions of it survive among the scrolls. One resembles the familiar Hebrew Bible read today, longer, with its chapters arranged in the standard expected sequence. The other is noticeably shorter, missing entire sections outright. Its chapters arranged in a completely different order. Before 1947, the earliest Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament available anywhere to scholars dated only to roughly 1000 CE. And for decades after, word experts had debated endlessly over what these divergent versions actually meant. An early draft, perhaps, or a later theological revision, or simply a scribal slip. The DNA finally gave a concrete physical answer to a debate that had run for decades. The shorter version of Jeremiah was written on cowhide. The longer version was written on sheepskin. Different animals entirely, almost certainly different regions. These weren't simply variant copies slowly drifting apart from one shared original source. They were two genuinely separate textual traditions developed independently of one another in two separate communities in two different parts of ancient Judea. Read that again because it matters. Two communities, two Bibles existing side by side. The team ran the same analysis on the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, a liturgical text describing angelic worship inside the heavenly temple, with copies found at both Qumran and at Masada, the mountaintop fortress where Jewish rebels made their final stand against Rome in 73 CE. The DNA showed that multiple Qumran fragments of this same text came from entirely different animals. This text, it turned out, was popular, widely copied, and produced independently in multiple places, not the guarded, exclusive property of a single isolated sect. Then came the kinship analysis, which added yet another layer to the picture. By examining nuclear DNA markers, researchers could sometimes identify parchments that came from closely related animals, siblings, or members of the very same flock. Clusters of related animals pointed toward specific production centers, places where several scrolls had clearly been made from locally sourced skins around the same narrow window of time. And here's the detail that mattered most. Some of those tightly related clusters, clearly produced together from a single flock, turned up mixed in among fragments with no genetic relationship whatsoever, coming from entirely different different animals and entirely different flocks. This wasn't a collection that had grown naturally out of one central scriptorium. It had been gathered together from multiple points of origin, representing multiple communities scattered across the region, spanning multiple decades, quite possibly stretching across whole centuries. The library theory didn't just crack under this weight. It came apart completely. A world of many voices. Here's what all of this actually means. If the scrolls had truly come from one isolated sect living at Qumran, their sheer diversity would make almost no sense at all. Why would a single disciplined community bother preserving competing versions of its own scripture? Why hold on to texts representing theological positions it actively rejected rather than simply destroying them? But if the collection had instead been gathered from many different communities scattered across ancient Judea, brought together in these caves gradually over decades, and finally sealed away by one catastrophic crisis, suddenly everything falls neatly into place. The diversity isn't a complication that needs explaining away. It's the entire point of the collection. The genetic evidence backed up something a few scholars had long suspected but could never actually prove. These caves, the very same ones Muhammad Eddib's stone broke open back in 1947, had functioned as a geniza, a sacred storage site where Jews from many different communities brought texts too holy to simply destroy, but no longer usable in daily worship. Jewish law forbids discarding any document that bears the divine name. Such texts must instead be respectfully preserved. Ancient communities across the region kept designated spaces called genizot for exactly this purpose. Now picture the surrounding geography. Jerusalem sits barely 20 miles from Qumran, a manageable journey by ancient standards. When Rome laid siege to the city between 68 and 70 CE, Jews fleeing that destruction may well have carried whatever sacred scrolls they could rescue out into the desert, adding them to a collection other communities had already been depositing there for generations. Family scrolls, synagogue scrolls, fragments of an entire world being rescued as everything familiar collapsed around them. These caves, then, weren't the private archive of one monastic order living apart from the world. They were a shared sacred library belonging to the whole of ancient Israel. And the cowhide fragments proved something even more specific about how that library came together. The texts were physically traveling between distant regions, carried from wetter, more fertile land to the north or west, into the very heart of the Judean wilderness. This wasn't a closed, inward-facing community guarding its own private truth. It was a living, breathing network of Jewish communities exchanging texts, ideas, and religious practice across real geographic distance. What that means for the origins of Christianity is genuinely significant. The world Jesus was born into wasn't one of settled, comfortable theological agreement. It was a landscape of vigorous, geographically scattered religious debate with multiple communities, each convinced they held the authentic tradition. The Dead Sea Scrolls weren't the position paper of one single faction inside that larger debate. They captured the entire argument in all its messy, contradictory detail. A Bible still very much being written. For scholars of Scripture, the implications reach even deeper than that. There was no single universally accepted text of Jeremiah floating above the fray. There were multiple versions, shorter and longer and differently arranged, each one treated as the authoritative form of Scripture by whichever community happened to keep it. The same pattern held true for Genesis, for the Psalms, for the various prophetic books. Canonization wasn't a finished process handed down from above. It was still actively underway, still contested, still genuinely unsettled. And now the DNA had proven that fact physically, not merely theoretically. Separate communities in separate places were independently maintaining separate versions of what they each called the Bible. The textual tradition wasn't fixed or frozen in place. It was alive, evolving, and it looked meaningfully different depending on exactly where you stood within it. The world in which Jesus taught and in which the earliest Christian movement first took shape was steeped in exactly this kind of diversity. Competing scriptures, competing interpretations of the law, competing visions of what God would do next for his people. And the evidence for all of it had been sitting quietly in dust on a storage shelf the entire time, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. Questions no one could ask before. The 2020 publication of this genetic research opened an entirely new chapter in Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship, one that's still being written. What it made possible to ask for the very first time may end up mattering even more than what it managed to settle. Before this work began, there was simply no way to scientifically confirm whether two fragments belonged to the same manuscript, whether a given text had originated in one place or many, or whether separate scrolls shared any real physical connection beyond a loose similarity in subject matter. Now, for the first time, there is. Can researchers pinpoint specific production centers for individual texts? Can they map out the entire geographic web of Jewish scribal communities that once stretched across ancient Judea? Can they trace, in real physical detail, how textual traditions moved from place to place over the course of decades or even centuries? Researchers are already chasing these questions, expanding DNA analysis to a much larger set of fragments, pairing that genetic data with multispectral hyperspectral imaging capable of recovering writing invisible to the naked eye, and building reference databases of ancient animal DNA drawn from across the ancient Near East. The goal is a geographic map precise enough that a single fragment could reveal roughly where, in the ancient world, the animal behind its parchment once lived. The work of reading the Dead Sea Scrolls, in other words, isn't finished. In many ways, it's only just now truly starting the story. Written in the skin, this genetic breakthrough represents something considerably bigger than solving one narrow archaeological argument. For 70 years, brilliant, dedicated scholars examined these texts with every tool available to them, deciphering ancient scripts letter by letter, translating difficult and obscure dialects, painstakingly reconstructing pages damaged by 2,000 years of time and decay. That work was real, valuable, and completely irreplaceable. But some questions sat permanently out of reach, no matter how carefully anyone looked. Handwriting analysis is inherently subjective. Comparing parchment by eye alone is imprecise. Textual criticism can spot patterns in the writing, but it can't always prove definitively whether those patterns emerged from one community or from many scattered across a region. Molecular biology offered a genuinely different way, in one nobody had thought to try before that lunch conversation. By reading the genetic information locked inside the very material these sacred texts were written on, scientists finally answered questions that had seemed permanently, hopelessly unanswerable. And what that evidence ultimately revealed turned out to be bigger than what anyone involved had originally hoped to find. The Dead Sea Scrolls, it turns out, are not the theological manifesto of one radical sect hiding out from Rome in the desert. They are the accumulated sacred literature of ancient Israel itself, gathered piece by piece over generations, diverse, contested, deeply and messily human in its contradictions. Multiple voices, multiple communities, multiple versions of the Bible, each one carried into a cave in the Judean wilderness by someone watching their entire familiar world come to an end around them. We only know any of this today because scientists finally learned to read a story that wasn't written in the ink sitting on the surface, but in the DNA of the animals whose skins carried that ink safely through 2,000 years of near total silence. In 1947, a shepherd's stone broke a clay jar and let an ancient world speak again for the first time in centuries. In 2020, a geneticist sequenced DNA pulled quietly from dust in a storage box. The shepherd opened the door. The scientist finally heard what had been waiting patiently behind it. If a single lunch conversation quietly rewriting the history of Scripture is the kind of story that grabs you, subscribe now and stay close because we're only just getting started.